Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
You meet someone online and there's this instant connection. It's amazing how much the two of you just seem to click. They live somewhere far away and there's some plausible reason they can't travel to meet you. They tell you they're in love with you and you feel optimistic for the first time in a long time. They have a successful career, yet somehow they need money from you to solve a short-term problem, always with the promise of paying you back. Time goes on and they need more money more urgently. You've started to see the cracks and begin to wonder whether they've been lying this whole time. All of a sudden it hits you. You've been scammed. Fool Me Twice is the story of my mother, Jules Hannaford, a woman who was drawn into the dangerous world of sweetheart scams. After a trip overseas to meet a stranger, a dangerous altercation in a Manchester hotel room, and thousands of pounds lost for good, she's here to tell her story. Fool Me Twice, a true crime podcast, is available on Apple Podcasts, Ozcast Network, and anywhere you listen to your podcasts.
Today I'm here with Bess Hepworth. Hey Bess, how's it going?
Jules Hannaford, long time no see.
Thank you so much for coming to join me today. And for the listeners out there, Bess and I are both from South Australia and we were born about 20 minutes from each
away.
other.
Yeah.
A town away in South Aussie. We're actually born about a decade apart and I'm the older one. But Bess, thanks so much for coming to talk to me. We've got so much to talk about. I'm concerned we'll be here all night, but let's see how we're going. I'm going to break this up into a number of episodes. So Bess, what were your early years like growing up in the country? What was it like for you? What are your earliest memories?
Okay, so when we're talking about SA, we're talking about Kapunda, near Yudunda and Tanunda, but you were Riverton,
Oh,
right?
Riverton, yeah, that's right. So they're all close by.
To be honest, my mum died when I was young. So my earliest memories, I was 5, and my earliest memories are more around that. To be honest, one of the earliest memories I have, full stop, is being at my grandma's house in Adelaide and Dad going, and 3 kids under 5. I was 5 at the time. My brother was 3 and my sister was 1. It was sort of like the family members were waving Dad off to go to the funeral. And there was just a moment where all I vaguely remember is asking to go and they didn't stop me. And the only other memory, and I can't believe you asked me this because we're doing this completely unprepared, unscripted. You've got no questions. I've not gone into this with prep, but it's triggering already some memories, is Mum was in a boating accident with my dad, and unfortunately it was in Victor Harbour and you couldn't write the script about the wind changing. And unfortunately she ended up on a respirator, and after the 4th day, Dad had to turn her off. And I think we went in to say goodbye to her, and this was in 1982. She had some sort of scarf on her head. And they are the earliest memories I own after 42 years. I was 5. So I know some people remember things at 3 or 4. I must have a bad memory because that's where I go.
Maybe it's something to do with the trauma of losing your mum at 5, that your memory before that is gone. You don't have any memories of your mum before that?
No, I don't. And this is so, I talk to the media all the time about LGBTIQ rights and different human rights issues. I have never talked about any of this. But talking to a fellow South Aussie neighbour is probably a good time to do this. But I think the issue was as well a little bit generational, let's say, within the Anglo-Saxon kind of Australian families. But none of the family have ever been able to talk about it ever since. It was like the big old carpet. I know more about the coroner's report and more about what happened in the accident. It was one that hit the paper at the time. And I remember reading, there's a quote that my poor dad, who was in shock, but I think also hopeful, because he said, oh, we're just going to stick to growing petunias next time. And I think, oh my God. It also makes me think about the media. When you read a story about what happened to someone, you may just assume everything's going to be okay. But he ended up being a widow of raising 3 kids under 5. But Dad's so broken by that. He's a beautiful man, but I see that trauma on his face. And without sugarcoating what I think their relationship was, I'm pretty damn sure they'd still be together. I see that in his eyes every day. So I think what I learned, kind of the Viktor Frankl, what can you take from this? All you can take from it is the good and the lessons, and radical way framing it as the gifts. The gift that I take from losing mum and seeing my dad suffer, like, it breaks my heart, but it makes my relationship with my wife so much stronger, and previous relationships, because I really cherish them. It also means that she has to deal with issues around, like, we must talk and sort this out in case one of us dies, and she's a pilot. So I do that silly stuff. And so I think grief is something just ends up being on your shoulder, and you just walk through your life with that.
It must have been quite difficult as a child not being able to talk about it. I remember a similar thing. One of my cousins died of cot death, and I remember being told not to bring it up when the auntie and the uncle and the other cousins came to visit. So I think it was part of the Aussie culture in those days. Let's not rock the boat. Let's kind of try to pull up our bootstraps and move forward. It must have been quite difficult. Give me a little bit more detail, because I'm very curious about the accident itself. What happened?
Yeah, so Mum and Dad were experienced sailors. They had a catamaran. And in fact, the way that I have read the story, 1 or 2 family members must have said something to me, but it hasn't. In over the years when I've tried to ask questions, like my dear grandma, who's departed now, was a matron in the war, very stoic, like kind-hearted. But I once asked her about mum when I would have been, I don't know, 10 or 12. And she said, why do you want to know about your mum? Do you want to blame your traits on her? And I was like, no, missed the memo, grandma. But again, like you said, it was the generation of that. Our generation, my mum's side of the family, always, I think some still do, but they go to Victor Harbour for the kind of Christmas, January holidays that Australia has. It was literally something that all the siblings did, and Nana and Grandpa did on Mum's side. And Mum and Dad actually took one of our other family members, I can't remember who, on a sail that morning. Again, I don't know enough about Indigenous culture as a white Caucasian woman, but the area that they were sailing in is known to be a sacred, like near the rocks. I'm not going to be able to articulate it properly, but I did hear that is an area that is kind of like a no-go zone. So they went out sailing kind of mid-morning and everything was fine. And then they decided to go out again. And again, like, it's quite profoundly traumatic, but it reads like a Hollywood script. It's like the weather changed. They were near kind of the Granite Island rocks, I think. Again, experienced sailors, but the weather turned quite dramatically very, very quickly. And they got thrust into it. And what happened is that the catamaran, like one of these little yachts, crashed against the rocks. I do play it back in my mind, imagining what this would have been like. But the catamaran itself capsized and Mum and Dad got thrown out. And it was so violent that when you read the report of the statements in the coroner's report, Mum's life jacket was torn off. That's how crazy it was. And I can't even fathom that. But again, they were very experienced. They were safe sailors, and it's just one of these freak things. Now, there were people at the top of the cliff that were looking down, and there were fishermen that were at another rock area. But it's that thing of you can't try to save people if you're going to put yourself in danger, and it was a really dangerous thing. Somehow they managed to get Dad, and they dragged him up onto the rocks. And there's a photo in the newspaper that has that photo. It's like freaky to look at. And Dad's a really tall guy. I think he's still... I've never asked him about the scars on him, but he has scars all over his legs. And I know that that's what that was from. And again, in the coroner's report, I'm getting goose, like it has my dad saying, someone save my wife, please save my wife. And nobody could. And he jumped back in the water. He managed to get her. And then she was flown by helicopter to Flinders Medical Centre, and he was at the Victor Harbour Hospital. And the other memory, I think a family friend told me this, and Dad's a very selfless guy. There was a moment while Mum was on the respirator in those days Like, I think we'd been given to family members. We might have been with Dad's mum. I don't remember that bit, but the story that I have been told is that Mum was coming too. And just for a minute, my grandpa, my mum's dad, was there, and Dad was there, I guess, waiting. And Dad said, one of you can go in. As the rules, only one of you can go in. So Dad said, no, you go, Mick. Mick was my grandpa's name. Grandpa Mick was saying, Patty, Vic's okay. The kids are okay. You're going to be okay too. Her name's Patricia, Patty. And she just shook her head as if to say, mm-mm. And then she slipped away. And then she didn't die at that moment, but the brain activity started to go. And so my poor dad ended up having to switch her off. So somewhere in there, we were given the chance to go and say goodbye. But doing that as a 5, 3 and a 1-year-old, I mean, my dad, he really is my inspiration. But we also have never moved on from a family in so many different ways, from January the 4th to January the 8th, and our family have never... I'm shaking, Jules, as I'm talking to you.
Yeah, it's so powerful, Bess.
I don't think I've ever shared so much. Yeah, so...
People can get stuck in the time
of
trauma, can't they? It can be hard to move on from it because it can be so impactful.
And it's one of those things... I think there was a train crash in Australia and victims talk about this, or survivors, that the date comes up and it manifests in your body. So you might not even realize. And then you're like, oh, yeah, here we are again. Like, you start to feel it.
And do you notice that around the 4th to the 8th
I
of
totally
January?
Do.
Wow.
And before that, it's something goes on physiologically, psychologically. And I don't talk to my family about it because, again, I was brought up to be this father sacrificed so much. Don't you talk to him about it? And nobody else could. They were literally broken. And I have trepidation about being public about this to re-traumatize them. I haven't moved on because my brother, I think, manifested this in a violent way. So unfortunately, there's a history that I carry of being psychologically and physically abused by my brother, which was really hard for my family to get around because they're kind of like, suffered enough. Don't make up these stories. Like, what are you doing? I've tried in my mid-40s now, I've tried to not bother anybody with all of this. But that has an impact on your family. And the thing is, Flinny, my 7-year-old, I want to be transparent with him. I don't want him to only know a coroner's report about me. And I cherish the fact that I've had him longer than he had. He's 7, so he's had a mum for 7. He's had 2 mums for 7 years. But it does play in your mind about, wow, like me thinking about his age and what that looks like not having a mum. I'm already grateful that we have collected all these memories because I don't feel like I have that. So not that I think I'm going to die tomorrow, but grief carries that feeling with you, right?
Yeah.
I try to think about that in my parenting. But one thing I was going to say is around the truth of all of this is I think because no one talked about it, my brother manifested this in a way that was testosterone fueled and no one would talk to him, and angry. And
so when did the abuse start?
He's 2 years younger than me. And again, I really am not saying this to cause more trauma to my family. Like, I'm so trying to be selfless in that I would have been maybe 14 and he would have been 12. And I think I was a scrawny kid, super sporty kid, but I'd been born with a bit of a muscle deficiency. So I was a super scrawny, skinny kid. And my brother had a little bit more meat on the bones and could physically dominate. My dad was a school teacher, so a lot played out when he was busy marking papers, or there was a lot of sinister things. He did a psychological kind of stuff, like he would turn the electricity off of the entire house, or he would do this mind control stuff. But as he got older, he got more violent. And unfortunately, I kind of have memories of running through the streets and him chasing me and me hiding in neighbours' yards, fearing for my life. And I was telling you off air, it's trippy to say, but I've got a mark on my back from when he thumped me once that has never left the back of my shoulder blade. And you touch it and it's sore. And I can't, like...
It's like a permanent reminder.
I think I use it as a bit of a gift because there's that moment that happened and it stayed with me. And maybe one day it might go, maybe after today it'll magically disappear. But I want you to see it because I want you to know. And we come back in 6 months, come back in a year, come back in 10 years, it will still be there. we've been together 16 years. I showed her 16 years ago. It's still there today. And it's as raw to touch as it ever was. But I think when you're a kid not being believed, that becomes a gift.
Tell me about that. Did you reach out to tell somebody that this was happening and you weren't believed?
Yeah, basically. Well, I got truth tattooed on my arm, mate.
This is one of the reasons why it's so good to be talking about this, because somebody out there who's listening, who's had somebody come to them and say this is happening and they haven't been believed, maybe this can make them approach things in a different way, or someone in this situation who's not reaching out, maybe it can inspire them to speak. So there's many reasons why it's great.
Yeah. Just to give the other example I hold on to is one of my best mates. I played football and that saved me as well. I've got a background in playing football and I played for SA, South Australia. And honestly, it was football that saved my life. I'm not even kidding you. So, and luckily through football, I was fit and I could outrun my brother. And that is literally, I wasn't stronger than him, but I could outrun him. And that is like all I had. But there was one moment where Dad had ducked out. He might have been outside or something. And my brother kind of attacked me with a bike pump and started laying into me. And it wasn't a pleasant experience. And my mate and I were able to overpower him and chuck him back in his room. And we had this weird bedroom. And it was problematic from the start that a cupboard divided us. So you could open the cupboard and your hand would go through the other. We should have nailed that bloody thing up right away. But we managed to get him back in his room and we closed the cupboard that was there. But I've never forgotten, and one of my best mates has never forgotten that, because it bonded us in a way that those traumatic moments do. But she was the person that was there to see it. So whenever family members would, obviously poor old, I feel bad that Dad had to deal with this on top of everything. And that was the messaging that we were given as kids, like, oh, you're just being silly. Just stop this. Your dad has suffered enough. It was all that. So I used to fear going to family occasions. Like I used to hate birthdays. I used to hate Easter and Christmas because it was an opportunity for members of the family, I don't want to name them, but to corner me in a room and say, why are you creating these lies? And the reason that they found out about it was, I said I played state football. My coaches, 2 women coaches at the time, could see something wasn't quite right. And by this point, I would have been about 15. And then they started noticing bruises on my body. They'd ask me about it and I'd be like, no, we're good. And then at one point, we had young coaches and we were like preteens. So we all used to hang out socially. It was like the wonder years of my childhood. Although I have this trauma, my football, I'm mates with my state team to this day. They are absolutely my saviors. We were at a swimming pool. It just caught me at a vulnerable moment, I think, and maybe it had just been too much. And so one of the coaches just said, Bess, we know something's not right, mate. What's going on? And then floodgates, right? Tears, floodgates, even a bloody bee sting. Unbeknownst to me, they were school teachers, so they had to mandatory report it. This thrust me into my dad being told and then hearing about this and then my family members being told. Again, it was just an automatic assumption that I'd made this stuff up. Out of nowhere, it got propelled into a wider circle. I had no idea. I didn't even know it. If I'd known, I would never have told them, right? But they were doing their duty of care and I don't blame them for that. I get that they had to do that. But that was the catalyst to my family, disbelieving me. And then being gay on top of that, it kind of looked like I was making up excuses to move out of home. Being gay was never just about that. It was always the underlying bit. And there's other potted chapters of that, but the underlying bit was that I wasn't believed. And my poor dad didn't really know what to do about it. And I think he had a family member talk to me. So I reluctantly went and I opened up my heart and I told her everything, hours, told her years of patterns of stuff that had been going on and how psychologically damaging it was and how physically abusive it was. He was just a kid. And so again, I see him as an adult. We're estranged and I'm trying to look at it differently. I'm trying to think with the deepest empathy I can that he was struggling and this was just his journey on that. And I went the depressive route. He went the aggressive route. May suffer from depression and anxiety. That's a closet I don't come out of too much and I should. But going back to this day, I remember vividly being at the Goodwood train station for the South Australians out there. This family friend, she was waving, she was hugging me goodbye and I was waiting to get the train back up to Glenouta in the hills where we live. She hugged me, and as I again, Hollywood script style, as the train was approaching the station and I'm getting ready, she hugs me really tight. And I exhale thinking, oh, thank God, I finally have a safe space. This is what I've craved within the family circle. It wasn't about having a go at my brother, but it was the not being believed bit, right? Super tricky to navigate that. And she said to me, I just don't know why you make up all these lies about your brother. And it was just at that moment, literally, heart drop. A part of me died inside right then and there and went, wow, I got no one to trust. I got no one except my women's soccer, football community. And that's why they are very much part of my chosen family. But that train ride home was just the most devastating. I couldn't even cry. I was just numb. I was just like, wow, I can tell you all of that and you don't believe me. What do I do with that information? So I kept quiet. The rest of my teenage time, I suffered the abuse and I went to the same school. My dad taught at the school. I tried really hard. There were still incidents at home, but I didn't talk to anyone about it. Cut to the bit about the mandatory report. That was after. So, because I'm a bit, as you are with trauma, you don't quite have it chronologically sorted in your head. But with the mandatory report came mandatory counselling, came statutory declarations, and just got thrust into the system of the South Australian counselling system. And it wasn't until cut to my 30s and Dad wanted to visit me and come out and visit for my birthday. In that time prior to, I'd had a big psychological breakdown. I was in our flat in Happy Valley for 3 months, didn't leave, left my job. I just had this I had forgotten in terms of when he was coming out. He was coming for my 31st birthday. That's the age my mum died. That's a way that my beautiful dad is so trapped in this trauma and grief that these little things that he does to show. And so we were going for a walk in Happy Valley, going up to Stubbs Road for the Hong Kongers. I just made some silly joke about aging, and Dad just turned around and said, I don't know, it's a bit of a milestone in our family. And boom, right then I went, oh, I'd remembered he wants to be here for 30. So he lives this every day. And we talked that night on our rooftop. And it's the first time that we confronted the reality of what was happening. And he,
with your brother, you mean?
And how do you do that as a father? I'm not asking him to choose sides, or it's such a difficult position to be in, but he was able to apologize for not kind of being able to cope. And the other thing is, poor guy didn't know how to deal with this. So I would be told to go outside and wait on the patio while he dealt with my brother in the room. This is tweens. So I would be outside patting the cat, and sometimes I'd fall asleep, and then he'd come out and we'd cuddle, and he was a man struggling, you know what I mean? My heart aches for him, and he was never prepared to cope with what happened. And he's now this beautiful guy in his 70s, and he's got my 7-year-old going about Nana Pat and asking him questions. And I worry about that, but I've got to have, my 5-year-old's nonverbal, so Gigi doesn't quite have the same relationship about it, but I want to talk to him about it. But Flinny, I'm really transparent with him. I've told him everything I know. I haven't talked to him about my brother. I don't want to do that, and I don't want to poison the relationship with him. And I'm also, my brother's got 2 kids and a wife that loves him, and it's really awkward and tricky. So when I'm back in Adelaide, it's just, we're broken. Them? We see each other when it's family occasions, and part of me wants to repair that relationship. But again, that time, we are stuck in those moments. We may never have the capacity and the skills and the people around us to get us through that. And I just want him to have a happy, good life, but we are still not okay.
Have you ever addressed it with him as an adult?
I'm scared to be honest. And again, doing this publicly is well, Bess, you want to go and speak to Jules, who's trending globally on her podcast, instead of calling us up. But I just hope if my family members do hear this, that they understand that we're all just broken. We're all just pieces of a puzzle that never got fit together again. And I'm not doing this. I've been so hesitant to, I'm holding back the tears. I'm so hesitant to talk about this because I don't want to re-traumatize them, but I'm stuck.
And maybe part of you just wants to be believed. Do you know what I mean? Maybe that little girl in you just needs to be believed. And as an adult, if you can own your story and tell your story, then people may be able to go, oh, all these years later, she's still sticking to that story. So maybe it's true.
And I'm still so broken.
And, of course you are. I cannot imagine living for years of having that fear of what's going to happen next and when's he going to come through the cupboard.
Yeah.
And when are you going to have to run for your life? Like, that's got to have a long-term impact on you.
And for many years, my wife couldn't lift her hand spontaneously to be affectionate without me flinching. And poor thing, like if we get into been married a long time now, we love each other, but if you get into a row, I'm not believed. I could be telling it wrongly, but that is so triggering. But I think now I'm very much in the human rights space, and I work with like Iranian activists and like our friends in the Russian LGBT network and Misha that you've done a podcast with, and all these like insane people that like you've interviewed. Like I haven't wanted to hold space for my trauma because it's not about comparative suffering, but in a way, they still feel like first world traumatic problems. And I think I'm trying to get to that point where I own my trauma, but I still feel incredibly humbled and inspired by the human rights activists that I'm around. And I think there is probably a part of me that throws myself into all this work because I want to be there for them in a way that possibly I didn't have someone. There's the clinch, but I'd like to think I'm doing it just because I want to be a human that wants to leave the world better than I found it. That's the ultimate goal. But I think this human rights work
is a subconscious connection to what you've been through.
Me being able to empathize with chosen family. And again, I absolutely love, like the trouble is there's a lot of family members I've held back from talking to about this because I've been so scared. And I didn't want to do a me versus him thing. And I don't know how you don't. Like if anyone wants to like advise me about this, I don't know how to reconcile owning and claiming my space for this trauma and setting myself free versus harming everybody in the wake of that. And I want to know who my mum is. Like I want to be able to tell my kids, and I'm really hesitant to even ask dad questions. And then a couple of years ago for a birthday present, might have even been last year or for my 40th, he gave me a picture of their wedding day. Like he's trying. I just cannot tell you and reiterate what a beautiful soul and a thoughtful soul he is. I mean, he's the guy that I learned social justice from. We went to sorry marches together in Adelaide. He's the guy that we'd go and buy a pizza and go and give it to the homeless man in the park in the Adelaide Square. And he's the most amazing ally. And when I came out to him, unfortunately, it wasn't about him having a struggle with my sexuality. Like I picked a fight to come out with him because I realized that we hadn't talked about it. And I'd been looking after a lot of my other friends when I moved out of home quite early. My poor dad pleaded with me not to, but it was the right move for all of us. Like, I don't have time to go into it, but I have had a couple of occasions where it would have been manslaughter, but there was no doubt my brother would have killed me. Like at a train station, being thumped downstairs. Like there were those sorts of quick things that happened that could have easily resulted in death without a doubt. But when I moved out, I ended up at Dad's place and we had this chat. I'm like, I haven't come out to him. I pick a fight with the poor guy to say, and while we can't agree with anything, why don't I tell you I'm gay?
How old were you?
I would have been about 17, 18. And he just turned around and said, what's that got to do with anything? And then I stormed downstairs and he came, like two-story house. He came down later and I think I was staying the night at his place that night. I was in this like little bedroom and then he came down about an hour later and just said, I don't care, literally verbatim I remember. He said, Bessie, I don't care what colour or what flavour you are. As long as you do the dishes and you don't fight with your brother, everything's okay. Unfortunately, the dishes I can cope with, but he never got the chance for us not to be seen as fighting. I think my brother had an envy around me representing state football. For a blink and you missed it, I was in the Australian football team. And I remember being at the Institute of Sport and being with all these players I admired. My Australian coach saying to me, you are as good as these players. You've got to stop idolising them. You were on this field. You were picked in this team. Believe that. And I never did. So I never quite got to be the Olympic athlete that my mates did. But I got into coaching and I coached the Australian under-19 schoolies.
Wow, that's great.
And I coached like a whole bunch of teams, like state teams. And
but that's
I think
also
that's
so
why,
interesting,
right?
because your self-esteem was so damaged based on what you'd been through. And your sense of self must have been so fragile. So how can you get to an elite level when you've just really suffered years of abuse?
And being at a school with my brother, I would get to school, get my name ticked off and walk the train lines back down the hill to the house I was living at with my coaches. The thing about living with my coaches is they were gay couple. My family members would be like, they're turning you gay and they've created this story in your head. And unfortunately, around that time in Australia, there was this bloody story about people that were creating stories to get government support. It just fit. It was convenient. And it was all just around this media hype around that perfect storm of not being believed, right? But the gay couple, they were in an abusive domestic relationship. So not only did I leave not a safe space, but I was in this bedroom of this house. They were supportive to me, but unbeknownst to me, they were in a domestic, like, abusive relationship. So doors would slam, and like that just was like, if only my family members knew, oh, it ain't like all roses there either, you know? So I was like,
so you moved out of home when you were still in high
17,
school?
yeah.
And your dad didn't want you to go, but you needed to save yourself from, protect yourself from your brother.
Yeah, and I broke his heart. And we talked about that on the 31st birthday, like, and I said, Dad, I never did that because I was trying to be some rebellious teenager. And my poor sister, who's gone on to be this extraordinary pediatric surgeon, she was so young at the time. She just locked herself in her room. It's affected our relationship, and she's such a incredible high achiever, but emotionally, we've not been able to talk about this either. But she's had difficult times with my brother when she was going through med school, and she might not appreciate me talking about this, but she needed me to write a statutory declaration so she could move out because the psychological torment was the problem. Got me to write a statutory declaration, and at that time, it was only then that we talked about the fact, I would have been in my early 20s, that all of this had happened and that she knew it had happened. But again, what she to do about this? Like, she was even younger.
You're all kids. You're all kids. You didn't have the skills or
didn't have the skills.
resources.
Dad was like doing extraordinary, like raising us in the 80s in a time that people literally would take kids away from single dads that couldn't handle it. He sews better, cooks better. He's the Mr. Mum. He did amazing.
Did he ever have another partner?
God, that's a whole nother podcast, mate.
Okay.
That's a whole nother podcast. But unfortunately, he did. And she ended up being a psychotic, pill-popping alcoholic and took him for a ride. She preyed on us and noticed that I had a sort of slightly different relationship with my brother. And she kind of did a number on me of being, I'm the mum you've never had. And she sucker punched me right into all of that and ostracized and abused my brother in a psychological way. That didn't last very long. Dad had to leave that marriage, but unfortunately she was very unstable. So poor old Dad is understandably not particularly trusting. He has companions in his life. I think he does have a relationship, but it's one that he's very guarded about. And his heart, again...
It broke when your mum died.
It broke on the 4th of Jan, and on the 8th it was destroyed.
Yeah.
Yeah, my goal is to make amends of all of this in a time that we're all still alive. But I'm so problematic around him because I just carry this wanting to talk to him about it. So,
and the older our parents get, the harder it is sometimes to address this stuff because they're getting older. You don't want to stress them out and you don't want to upset them.
No,
but
exactly.
It could be quite healing for everybody.
Yeah, and
quite cathartic.
I've hinted, I think 2 years ago, I hinted to him that I'd really like to sit down and record some memories. But again, being so careful of not re-traumatizing. But I think we might get to that point that we can find a way to, even if he audio records stories. And it's also to be able to tell the kids what Nana Pat was like, because they're down a Nana because of this, right?
You don't really know what Nana Pat was like,
I
do
don't.
you?
I really don't.
No.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the football team saved your life. Were you feeling suicidal as a teen?
I don't know if I was, but I think if I didn't have them, that could have definitely been an issue. And I definitely have traumas that have led to trigger warning for anybody that's struggling.
I'll put a trigger warning at the beginning.
I definitely, even quite recently in the last year, have suicidal ideations, and my wife is amazing for having to deal with that. And I think also I throw myself into my work to the point of passion burn and exhaustion.
I've seen you do it. I have witnessed it. And
and
hearing all of this really makes me understand more why you do it. I mean, in a way, I throw myself into stuff to avoid other stuff as well and to compensate for the loneliness and for aging and menopause and all that sort of stuff, which my listeners are probably sick of hearing about. Sorry, guys. But I get why you're doing that. But it's really interesting that still these little pockets of trauma keep coming up in your life because you're not really addressing stuff, or that little girl in you haven't been believed, and the only answer really is to have therapy, isn't it?
Yeah, and luckily I have got a good therapist now. So, I mean, this podcast will not be a user's guide to get over trauma. I'm not exactly a best case model here at all.
And I'm not qualified either, just to remind everyone. I'm just a school teacher.
I think also, ironically, I think my work ethic comes from being a high performance football coach. And then for a little short period of time, I played cricket for Hong Kong. Although I'm in the worst physical shape of my life right now, embarrassingly, I've got a background of high performance sport. And I think I am an activist in that way. And so I've realized in hindsight, I've replaced picking Australian players or state players or, picking teams. I've replaced athletes with human rights defenders. Yeah. And I curate these international events and I pick these extraordinary, and now I'm doing a little bit in the sports space of working with asylum seekers through a psychophysical and refugees through a psychophysical program, but also on the international stage looking at the mega sporting events. And I've gone into, under the lens of travel and the Miles of Love work that we do in travel advocacy, I'm partnering with LGBTIQ athletes, and I love it. It's
that's
my
brilliant.
world.
Now you've married the worlds together.
Yeah, and that's
awesome.
Definitely what's going on there.
So have you been able to recognise that you overdo it, and are you winding back?
I'm trying.
Or are you putting more focus in family and yourself? Is it hard?
It's so hard. And the thing that my beautiful wife, Kirst, has to, it looks like I choose family second, but I think that trauma makes me loyal to any other human rights issues, to help someone in need. What I've done is I've thrown, at times, and it's hard to admit, I've thrown my family under the bus because I've just tucked them under the wing and gone, we're all going to sacrifice. And I don't envy her because she's got to push back and say, we don't, come on, what about us? And then we've got Jude, who's our 5-year-old that's deaf, non-verbal and going blind, and so we're not short of therapy sessions that we need for him and work around how to support him and how our family does that. So some people think quite legitimately that I'm absolutely crazy to put on this extra part, but in some ways it makes me a better wife, mother and activist, and in some ways it makes me worse at all three. So it is that constant balance, and as I get older and take more leadership roles and more responsibility, I've got to own that more because I don't want to self-harm the communities I'm working with. I want to keep the ring on my finger that I cherish, which is actually my mum's wedding ring that's melted down. So that's really special.
I think really reading into what you're saying as the armchair psychologist that I am.
Can I come see you next week?
Yeah.
Let's make this a thing.
It really seems like nobody was there for you in your greatest time of need, and now you are there for every man and his dog.
Standby 24/7.
You are on standby for any emergency, and you're a global human rights defender, and you're there for the underdog. And it really does make sense why that's happening, but I guess you haven't quite found that balance yet. Yeah. And I think that will come because...
Do you think I ever will? I mean, I hope so.
Do you know what? I reckon you will because of Jude.
Yeah, I do
think
agree
you
with
will
you.
Because of Jude, because you've got that son that's going to need you. He's going to need you, and he's at mum so much more than Flinny does. Yeah. You're going to have to put the time into him because of what's going on with him. So just before we move on to Jude, I just want to cover one more thing and we'll get to Jude. What was it like realizing that you were gay? When did you realize you were gay? And was that difficult, or does that even feature in your upbringing, or were you so entrenched in the abuse that really wasn't anything that really was there for you?
Yeah, no. And it's that, and I think that's one reason why I can leverage the privilege of not having trauma around coming out. Maybe one uncle who was a police officer struggled a bit, but maybe within my dad's family, one brother, the former police officer, that I think definitely homophobic tendencies, and then a very high-profile priest who actually, again, is another podcast, but he featured on the Australian newspaper on the front page for coming out in his 70s about being a member of abuse in the church. And so that plays a role in our family as someone who was abused. Yeah. And so
then we can get into that whole DNA thing and everything coming down through the family and how you're impacted by what's gone on in previous generations.
Yeah, I mean, and also as someone who was coming out gay in their teenage years, that could have been incredibly triggering in the men who were having sex with boys, whether they were gay in the closet or pedophiles. That could be triggering for my uncle who spoke out publicly on radios about gay marriage and same-sex relationships.
Against it.
Yeah. But I think in his personal life was a little more comfortable, but in his professional life was a mouthpiece in South Australia for this conversation. I'm not really connected to those members of my family. And I do think that I have sacrificed time with my cousins and some of my aunties and uncles that I genuinely love because I just stepped right back and went, okay, you don't believe me. And one family member who I won't name actually kind of did this whole, it's good to see you've come good, Bess. Like, good to see you back on track.
What, so you've stopped lying about your brother? Is that what he means?
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, as we wrap this, I don't know what to do about talking about this publicly because I don't want to ruin my brother's reputation. I just want to frame it as we were all kids stuck in this, and I don't blame my dad. He was shoved into this, okay, soldier, chin up, bootstrap, here we go. I think what he has done to raise us in the way is extraordinary. I'm definitely going to struggle when this goes public, but I really hope that my family members hear this and know that it's coming from a place of genuine, can we be more cathartic? Can we talk about this? Can we all move forward? And maybe my brother and I can have that moment where we put it in the 90s and the early 2000s and we can move forward together.
It's pretty unlikely that your brother's going to stumble across this podcast. Would you share it with him? Like, would you ask him to listen?
No, I'm worried about the harm that would do. He doesn't have a massive digital footprint.
Right.
So
he probably won't come across it
his
anyway.
wife has a bit more of one though. And I'm conscious of, I don't know if she even knows about this. And I don't know if my niece and nephew will ever know about this. And it's not my place to ever say.
Sure.
I've talked a bit to my cousins about things over the years.
When you left home, did the abuse stop?
In the sense that I just didn't see him, It did. But then at family occasions and even funerals, massively triggering. One wedding I didn't go to, and I should actually tell my cousin why, because I was just too broken. It was shortly after I moved out and I was too traumatized and triggered to see him. But it was the time that I was just being a rebellious, disrespectful kid. And I never stood up for myself and tried to rebut that because what do I do with that?
And you never had any counselling or support in those years?
Lots of it. In fact, one psychologist was so off the wall terrible that as I was repeating the story or sharing the story about mum and dad's boating accident, he popped up and said, oh, yes, I had a catamaran and this is it was so like, are you freaking kidding me? Like,
it's so important to be with the right person for therapy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, and have the connection and somebody who's good at their job.
Lots of it. Moving back to Adelaide next year after 14 years in Hong Kong, I am going to shop around for somebody because I do want to kind of lead into Jude, I guess. But there is so much I need to hold space for. And Flinny, because this is hard for him to navigate that as well. But to get the balance and also just to not let my depression, anxiety, Kirsty's going to be commuting. So she's not going to be on the ground more than a few days in a month. So that's a big shift for us. But we started that way 16 years ago of commuting. So we know what that's like.
And I guess you recognise now that your children are getting older that you need to work on yourself and your emotions and your anxiety and depression and the trauma that you've been through so you can be the best version of yourself for your children and have a positive impact on them.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's really, very, very healing and healthy to talk about stuff and cathartic. And, Brené Brown's amazing. She's got some amazing stuff. And I know we both did that daring.
Oh, yeah. Shout out to
Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca Hopkins. If you're in Melbourne and you want a Brené Brown,
please
she's
connect
amazing.
With her. She's phenomenal.
But there's so much to get out of that about vulnerability and owning your story and letting go of shame and all of that. It's really brilliant.
The shame shields the story in your head. So that plays out with triggers around truth that Kirst and I God, I love my wife so much. And she's taken that on, and I shared that. She hasn't done the course, but I shared those things. And she says, look, the story in my head I'm hearing is this. And we like, but I definitely do like fire off. And I have, that anxiety has turned into anger, which has been shame. And a lot of it's been self-hatred, but it ends up manifesting, projecting in her direction, even if it's not to her. And then you go, oh God. And that's where the suicidal ideation plays out for me.
Because you feel so terrible about the way that you're behaving.
In that absolute moment,
about yourself.
I just want out. I'm like, who am I? How can I do? Like, it's never, again, trigger warning, but my suicidal ideations are never premeditated. They're in absolute throes of desperation and anxiety that is just so consuming. I just don't even know how to be on this earth and be useful.
And I hear you, and I don't know what that feels like because I've never experienced it. And I'm really sorry that that happens. But you have to be more forgiving of yourself. You have to take that little girl inside of you and nurture and tell her you understand that all of this stuff that you're dealing with now is not her fault. Look at me. I'm acting like I'm some therapist.
No.
But, you know, it really is about forgiving yourself and allowing yourself space to grieve and to go through all of the emotions. But you've got to do more work on yourself to get to that place, I'm sure.
Shout out to partners who absorb this. People. And sometimes behind the scenes, right? Because this is not stuff that you're usually so public about. And I don't think some people would be shocked to hear me talk about suicidal ideations.
Of course they would. And this is something that is really important for people to know. You never know who is struggling. You cannot assume. Bess, for those who don't know her, presents as a go-getter and confident and a great communicator and a great friend and a great leader and somebody who's a role model for others and somebody who can take the stage and hold court to thousands of people and has been in international events and international forums. And this is a lesson. It's so good that you're, the courage that it takes for you to share.
I think it's important to own that for others. It's so good
for others to know that you just don't know who is struggling behind the facade that they're putting out in public. Don't make any assumptions. And if people get an inkling something's not right, ask people if they're okay. And if somebody comes to you, believe them. I've mentioned this before, but I did that suicide assist course, which was incredible. And one of the most interesting things about it was if you're worried about somebody, ask them directly if they're feeling suicidal. You can't give somebody the idea. And it's something that, people often, if they are feeling that way, will then gratefully open up and talk about it. And then you can make a plan to help them. You don't have to solve the problem. You just have to give them like first aid in that moment by keeping them safe. And then getting them the support from the professional. By asking that question, you don't have to fix the problem, but you can then help them get the support from GPs, counsellors, helplines, local support systems, local clergy, whatever it is. But there's plenty of people out there that can help and support. So I think this is a really important message to get across.
My default tends to be recluse. So I'll just go MIA. And because I've got a deafblind, nonverbal 5-year-old and do a bunch of stuff, and of course with Flinny as well, but people just go, oh, we know you're so busy, when I know exactly when I'm checking out. I guess moving back to Adelaide next year, I've got some unbelievable friends that have been with me through this and known about this, but I'm scared to tell them that I'm not as mentally strong as I need to be. And I need to be like, going into domestic boot camp. The next few months are going to be pretty important to do that. So maybe putting this out publicly is going to help. I did put a Facebook post out in December. What did I say?
You really just said, I want to open up and let people know that I'm struggling. I'm not coping and things are falling down. I need to step back. I need to take some time for myself. You wanted to step away from social media, which is probably a healthy thing to do. Because you're all over it with your activism. But I don't know how I knew. Maybe you've just dropped little comments here and there, but I wasn't surprised by that. But I just think that's the connection that we've had.
running 2 international events in the space of a month wasn't the greatest idea in the world.
And I
around
also
it.
can relate to that overcommitting thing. I really can. And to the point where I got anxiety last year when I was doing the book. And I've never, ever had it in my life. I've never had any kind of mental health issue. And to have anxiety for that year was really interesting. And it was very situational. So I'm lucky that it's not innate or it's not from trauma from the past. It was really the situation I'd put myself in. But it gave me a much different perspective on what is really like to go through that and how difficult it can be, how you've got to put your game face on. You've still got to go to work and look after the kids and keep going and run relationships and all of that. And also, it really surprised me how physically it affected me. I didn't know. Like, I thought I was having heart attacks and lung cancer, and I thought I was really sick. But, I was having all these tests, and then finally it's like, oh, it's anxiety. Like, I didn't really realize how it would manifest so physically.
And I think on that physical manifestation thing, there's more and more research coming out about the psychological trauma that you store can, if you look at different folks who are going through cancer or other like serious illness, it's whether or not they've like navigated the trauma in their life. And some people, whether they, again, looking at it as what are the gifts that you take from this, without sounding like an utter hypocrite right now. But I am conscious that I'm 43 this year. I need my health for my wife, for the kids, for the work I want to do to hold space for the activists that are literally on the front line of so much vitriol and violence that I don't experience. I carry the history of my childhood, but I'm not being victimized right now. I don't have vigilante gangs. Like, the work that I do, it is full on and serious, but I'm not worrying about Hong Kong's vigilante group being hunted like our friends in Russia. Or,
exactly. But as Brené Brown reminds us, it's not about comparative suffering and your anxiety, your trauma, your experiences, they're yours, they're real, they've impacted you, and you're now starting to own that. And I think this is one of the first steps, is talking about it and putting it out there and working through it. I'm hopeful that when we finish and you leave, that you feel lighter and that there's a weight off. Then you wake up tomorrow and panic about...
I'm freaking out right now about my family members. I'm not even kidding you. I'm freaking out, but I just hold the purest of my heart. I mean, if they are not there on their journey of this is going to be quite triggering for them. But if they don't believe me after all this, I have to be at peace with that. It's a difficult thing.
And also, this is your journey and your story, and you're allowed to tell your story. Like, something that I can see for you is you're so empathic and generous and kind and worried about everyone else.
Body language, if you could see it right now, I'm like
Bess is hunched up in a little ball.
Oh my God.
But the thing is, you're so concerned about everybody else and you're not putting yourself first.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that you could maybe take from this is you taking back your power. And this is you empowering yourself and putting yourself first just for this little fraction of time.
One thing that's reminded me of recently is Flinny has some negative self-talk issues. And so that is the biggest catalyst to get your shit together, girlfriend. Like, aside from my poor wife, but like literally when you hear, like, you're like, oh my God, like, what are the things that I say? What am I mirroring? What is he picking up about this? Like, he's such an affectionate, beautiful soul that has had to deal with a lot in playing second fiddle to Jude, who's this like incredibly, you know what he's like. He sucks the oxygen in the room in the most positive way. And Flinny plays second fiddle to that, and his ego hasn't suffered in the sense of him being jealous, or none of that's played out. But I worry sometimes that the fact that I have such an odd relationship with truth, I'm almost too oversharing with him, that I've got to be really careful. I mean, I don't try to like put massive language around what's happening, but I am truthful with him. And if I'm not feeling okay and I'm feeling triggered, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I say, Mummy's not feeling calm right now, Flinny. I really need you to help me. And because Kirsty's a pilot, sometimes she's not on the ground, right? So on the weekends in particular, I'll think nothing of like traveling the ends of the earth to an amazing playground, because I'll think that's a safe space for us. But I might not catch up with my friends. And if my friends hear this finally, they might know that I've chosen not to be social with them because I haven't felt safe in my ability to not spill everything that's going on. So I'll choose really wacky ways to have fun with the kids.
Yeah.
Like,
you know what's interesting though? I think
avoidance and all of that.
I think many of your friends would welcome these conversations.
Yeah.
They'd be open to holding the space for you instead of you holding it for someone else.
A bit of a role reversal that I'm not comfortable with.
But also one of the things that I can share with you that I've learned as a parent of a now 30-year-old is that I shared too much with her when she was a child. Oh my God,
you're scaring me, Jules.
No, your child, it was mainly when she was a teenager.
Okay.
It was mainly when she was a teenager, and if I could go back, I wouldn't use her as much like a friend as I did. I would go to my friends and use other support systems.
Yeah.
So I think being just the two of us and a single mum, I think I relied on her for a support too much.
Yeah.
And I treated her too much in an adult way. So I think you're not lying to your children by protecting them.
Yeah.
But I think there is a line where you don't want them to worry too much.
Yeah, and in human rights spaces as well. Like there's a whole thing as well. I love the Rainbow Families work that I get to do, because human rights defenders that are parents, how you navigate that with your kids. Like,
I don't think you need to lie, but I think there's a level of share to this point,
exactly,
not to this point.
No, it's
because
how you
don't want your kids to get anxious or worried because of what you're going through.
Yeah.
And all parents protect, and I think it's finding that line of truth but protection.
There's a great book about this monkey, Chutney, and it's about the chimpanzees of Happy Town, I think it's called. And it's this beautifully framed book that talks about this one kind of overzealous, happy chimpanzee, and the whole town is like dark and it's black and grey and black and white. And he wants to plant this plant that's going to be this beautiful coloured thing. And the mayor of Happy Town, I don't even think it was called Happy Town. I can't remember what the town is called. Spoiler alert, they end up calling it Happy Town. But it's all about how the bad mayor tries to shut down Chutney. And it's such a beautiful framing about human rights. And so I talked to Flinny, he's 7 now, but when he was 5, I was saying, Mummy works with the people that have got bad mayors and she tries to help support them. But also in the rainbow family sense, to say to him, in some countries, 2 mums,
is not accepted.
Yeah, exactly.
And you've got to still keep them abreast with what's going on in the world.
Delicate.
It's hard to find the line, and I'm sure you're doing an amazing job.
I don't know. But it is very cathartic to talk to my fellow activists about this who are parents, because we also have this WhatsApp chat called the Activist Wives Club, because we talk to each other about how we sacrifice our family. Like the drive to help create change and to be there for others. There's the common thread between all of us, but our partners suffer. How do you reconcile with that when you love someone so deeply and dearly? It's that line. So none of us do it well. None of us do.
Well, you know what? I think that's the other thing that you've got to come to terms with as a parent. It's the only thing in the world you don't have any training for. Mm-hmm. You don't get a license to be a parent. Yeah. And also, none of us are perfect.
Yeah.
We're all going to have regrets and make mistakes. Mm. And then there's all amazing things that we do. And we're bringing up amazing kids. So, and we do the best with the tools that we have.
Exactly.
And the history that we bring. So that's really important.
And our bear cubs are just so delightful and they're so affectionate. I just want to hold on to that purity that they have for as long as we can.
We're just going to finish here, and next week we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about Bess's family and Jude in particular. So thank you so much for today, and we're going to continue on. That's absolutely amazing, and I hope people will tune in next week to listen more.
Right. I've never talked about this.
Thank you for having the courage to share, and thank you for talking to us about your journey, and I really hope that it impacts other people positively, and I hope it helps to heal wounds in your family as well.
Thanks, mate. And it's a compliment to you for... I know you've been after me a while for this one, but we've just done it impromptu today with no thought about it.
Which I think has worked out absolutely beautifully. So that's absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.